Good. Okay. And then to really kind of like just not to kind of like impose some kind of alien solution upon them, but to provide some kind of solution that meshes with the way that they're already kind of like working. And then after this project, if that works, to see if we can kind of like extend some of these principles to kind of like target a wider variety of data set providers. So I'll start by just giving a kind of like, a brief outline on some of my kind of like observations on metadata, particularly how it relates to software development and dataset distribution and development. And the context for this is some related work I did kind of in parallel on two very different projects. One is the Open Biomedical Ontologies Registry, and the other one is on an eco-informatics project called Global Biotic Interactions. They both kind of require metadata to some degree. And then that led to my idea for this approach in this Harvester project, and I'll kind of just kind of outline where I want to be going with this over the next 6 months. So, the first observation is that, in actual fact, if we look at software developers, they actually love providing kind of like metadata for their projects. Maybe they don't think of it as providing metadata, but if you were to go and search over a code repository like GitHub for all cases where people have included something like a package JSON file or a POM XML file, you'll see that there's almost up to kind of like 1 million in some cases. Now of course, programmers aren't doing this just out of their love of providing metadata about their project. They're providing these because these are actionable files that help them with their kind of like day-to-day work and help them integrate with other pieces of code and so on. It's really just a kind of necessary part of software development in the current ecosystem to provide these kind of like package descriptors that say what the contents of your site are, what of your project are, what their dependencies are, and provide other information such as version numbers and so on. So I wondered, is there a way to get dataset providers to share this kind of love of providing some kind of like useful nugget of information with their datasets? And I think this is actually this is something that we will probably start to see happening more. So I just found this quite nice paper in the Journal of Source Code for Biology and Medicine, and it's really just about how the Git version control system and related hosting sites such as GitHub and GitLab provide a really nice way of not just sharing your software, but it's a nice framework for actually managing your kind of like other information and research data artifacts such as your data sets and your code, figures and so on. And so we're starting to see more people actually using GitHub, not just for sharing software, but for sharing things like data sets as well. And so, some related kind of experience here is, so I'm one of the administrators for the Open Biomedical Ontologies Registry, which is part of the OBO Foundry. And the idea here is that over the last 9 years or so, we've been providing what we hope to be high-quality metadata on about 100 different ontologies. And this differs slightly from projects such as BioSharing and BioPortal, in that we really kind of like want to kind of like go in depth with our kind of like metadata and capture things that are of relevance to us in the OBO Foundry. And so because of that, we do our own kind of like curation, or historically we always did our own curation on this metadata. But we had a number of problems. The format that we were using to describe the metadata was a bit limited, but the main problem was there wasn't really a way for the ontology providers to provide that metadata for us, because we curated it centrally. So when we did a revamp of the site, I decided to look at using GitHub, not just to kind of like store the code, but to really make use of the whole GitHub ecosystem, which provides you things like mechanisms such as the ability to do distributed coding through pull requests and so on. I mean, by the way, I'm kind of assuming here that I'm sort of talking to the kind of technical group, so people are sort of reasonably familiar with using GitHub as a mechanism. But if people want a little bit more explanation, just kind of interrupt, and I can explain. I can give a little bit more context. But the basic idea here with the new OBO registry was that we would manage the metadata files themselves on GitHub. The format we used was YAML, which is nice because it's both simple, but it's extensible as well, and you're not limited to simple tag value pairs. You can have a kind of like a complex, deep nested object-oriented representation. And what is really nice is that other people can come in and they can just use direct, without even leaving the GitHub web interface, they can click edit on any of these files, and they can make changes on their own personal branch, and then they can make what's called a pull request. And so their changes don't go directly back into the repository. They have to be approved by someone who has the keys to the main project site. But all of this is transparent, and you can actually have discussions about the pull request and so on. So it's a very kind of like nice, open, transparent, distributed way of kind of like sharing the task of curating these metadata files. And so we can actually have we can actually see that this has been quite successful, because over the last few months that this site has been in operation, it's no longer the just me and the other OBO administrators who are curating this metadata. We're getting people who are coming into the website, making changes, making pull requests. So this is a list of our kind of like closed pull requests on the GitHub site. And so some related experience on another project called Global Biotic Interactions, which is a kind of web-based search portal for people to find data regarding species-species interactions. So you can go to the site and ask questions like, what are some of the things that interact with a species like bats in a particular region, like the USA? And you can ask more specific questions like, find me all data sets that show interactions between kind of like parasitic fungi and bats in the USA. So this is really just a big kind of data aggregation project. It pulls in 12 million species interactions from about 15,000 different studies, and these studies come from a variety of sources. Some of them are kind of like sort of online citizen science tools like iNaturalist. Some are data repositories like Dryad, but often it's really just people have deposited a study on their website in some kind of ad hoc format. So it's really just a kind of big sort of harvesting project. So for the first version of this, what we did was we really just kind of wrote code that was specific to each individual data source and just kind of ingested it in a nightly build of the database. Kind of fairly standard database ETL type pipeline. But this didn't really kind of like scale, because there wasn't really an easy way for other people to kind of like contribute to the project and provide their data sets, or for a third party to come in and describe a data set and say, hey, do you want to kind of like integrate this file over here? Here's some metadata on it. They would have to have come in and edited the code centrally, which really doesn't scale very well. So the solution we came up with was we came up with a simple JSON file format, and the idea is people put this globy.json file in the top level of their GitHub repository, and that GitHub repository can either contain some species interactions, for example, as a tab-separated file or in JSON, or it can perhaps point to an external repository. And then the search engine, rather than having a kind of like hard-coded set of sources, can just go out and query, search over GitHub, find all these metadata descriptor files, and then kind of like slurp everything in from there. And that provided a really kind of a nice decentralized way to kind of like have other people contribute their data sets without kind of like changing the central code base. So the idea here is to try and take some of these ideas and apply it in this bioCADDIE harvester project. And the core idea is to define a format for a simple metadata file, and it's inspired by things like a packaged JSON file that programmers would typically include in the root level of their project directory. But this is more geared towards data sets rather than code. It will be in YAML, possibly embedded within Markdown, which is another easy-to-author documentation format. And the idea is you just plonk this in the top level of your GitHub or perhaps GitLab repository, and it can be either in the same repository as which you're managing your data, or in some cases it can just be a repository that only contains metadata and then points outside to some external source and says, oh, the data that I'm describing can be got from this URL in Figshare or Dryad and so on. And then working from there, we really leverage the whole GitHub kind of social coding system to allow things like distributed editing of these files. So the idea is anyone can then come along and say to one of these kind of like projects and say, oh, I think your description of this metadata is incomplete. I'm going to add an extra field for you, make a pull request, and then the person who owns that metadata file can then just, with a click of a button, pull that information back in. And we can also leverage things like continuous integration systems that are out there on the cloud and already integrated with GitHub. So there's one called Travis that is really a standard part of many software developers on GitHub, their workflow these days. And then finally, we'll work with a kind of like a pilot project where we will select some data sets out there and apply this methodology and demonstrate the ability to search for this either just in a little kind of like sample, a simple kind of like web app or something that could possibly be more integrated into bioCADDIE. So this diagram here kind of shows the basic idea. So in the center, we have our kind of Git-based kind of repository, GitHub, GitLab, the kind of hosting site. And within that, there are a number of kind of projects or repositories. Each of these has the YAML file at the top of it. In some cases, such as in repository B, the YAML file is really describing a data set that can be pulled from somewhere outside of GitHub. It might be on NIH Commons. It might be managed using Git LFS, which is a new way of managing large data sets within GitHub, which is very nice because you get a lot of the benefits of GitHub, such as versioning and rollback and so on, but without the kind of file size limits that currently limit the use of GitHub for big data projects. And in some cases, for example, in repository A, the data set will be contained within the GitHub repository itself. And the idea here is that the kind of researchers producing data can deposit their data and then describe it using these YAML files, and they get instantaneous checks using from Travis continuous integration, and there can be automatic conversions from the YAML into kind of like formats such as the HCLS, Healthcare and Life Sciences, dataset descriptor profile, which enables kind of like a broader search on the semantic web. But I think the main goal here is to kind of like make this searchable within bioCADDIE, which I have a very kind of like simplistic representation of in the lower part of this diagram. And the idea is bioCADDIE could essentially scrape GitHub looking for these any data sets with these descriptors and use that to enhance its own indexes. So at the moment, I've deposited I've created a GitHub repository for this project. It doesn't have any code in it yet. Officially, I haven't actually started the project. I'm going to hope to do this in a couple of days. There's just a couple of negotiations that are happening between, I think, UCSD and LBNL, and then we should be able to get moving on this. At the moment, I've just placed this in my own repository, so I assume there's it would probably be a good idea to push this to something like the bioCADDIE organization on GitHub, assuming that exists. But so far, all that exists in this repository are the project milestones, which I will go through now. So the first milestone is to really define this YAML format that people can use to drop files in the top of their repository. The idea to use YAML is it's simple, it's easy to author, it's nestable, and one really nice feature is that it's a superset of JSON, and JSON is like very widely used for machine-to-machine exchange on the web these days. And there's a very nice kind of not really extension of JSON, but really a kind of subset of JSON called JSON LD, which kind of in a way magically makes a JSON file equivalent to an RDF or RDF OWL file. So what we can essentially do is define a JSON LD context that makes these YAML files semantically equivalent to an RDF file that is consistent with the HCLS dataset description profile, which is very nice because I think the HCLS have done a great job in defining what the right way to describe data using RDF. Unfortunately, the standard they've produced is actually quite difficult to apply at the moment. You need to use some kind of like RDF authoring tool, or you need to be some kind of like wizard who can author RDF turtle in a text editor or something like that. And that's just really not very practical for a lot of people. Whereas JSON, whereas YAML is really, it's really kind of like simple and lightweight, and it's really fairly easy for most people, even without kind of extensive kind of like software experience, to just author this directly using a text editor or whatever. And so the basic idea here is that these YAML files go in the top level of the repositories, either containing the data sets or pointing externally to those data sets. So the second milestone is to implement a validator for this. And the key idea here is really not to do the validation way downstream, by which time it may be too late. The person may have moved on to another project and may not be interested in fixing what they're doing anymore. The idea is to kind of validate the files as soon as any changes are pushed. And this is a kind of common practice now with software development and continuous integration and unit tests. And so this is where the GitHub Travis CI system comes in. And what we can essentially do is define a Travis YAML file that sits in the GitHub repository. What this does is that it means anytime anyone makes any change to their bioCADDIE YAML file, it will trigger Travis to run our validators on that and report back any possible changes, any syntax errors or anything that's missing from the file. And this is particularly nice when it comes to doing things like evaluating pull requests, because the pull request will actually show you, hey, you shouldn't merge this change back in yet because the change this person wants to make introduces a syntax error, and that will cause problems downstream when we try and index things. So it's a very nice way of catching issues as far upstream as possible. So what we'll do here is we'll just write, probably in something like Python, a simple validator that will check the YAML files to make sure that they conform to the standard that we define. So this diagram just kind of shows you roughly how that would work, and so there's a kind of sequence diagram as well that I won't kind of go through the individual steps here. Moving on to the next milestone, which is to provide a way for people to kind of like immediately see in a nice HTML format what their metadata file looks like. And again, this was kind of inspired with what we did for the OBO Foundry registry, whereby people can edit the YAML files for their ontology metadata, and then through the magic of GitHub Pages, they see their changes on the site kind of immediately. And it turns out not to be a lot of work to do this. if you use something like the GitHub Pages framework. And the idea here is that it's a kind of like a sort of like cloud-based system for doing static site generation. You can just define some HTML templates that says how the YAML file should be rendered, and then anyone making changes on GitHub should see those changes immediately on the corresponding kind of like GitHub Pages view of that repository. And so the next milestone would be to demonstrate searchability of these YAML files. And I'm open to advice here on exactly how we should do this. I mean, we could treat this Harvester project as just its own independent pilot file at the moment, and we could implement just some very basic kind of search system that queries over sites like GitHub, looking for all the kind of the bioCADDIE YAML files that have been deposited there, and really just providing some very simple proof of principle kind of like a search interface for that. But maybe as part of this pilot project, we might want to think about how that may integrate into the more general bioCADDIE index. But to be honest, I haven't been involved in the technical side of bioCADDIE at all until now. So I'm not really sure how feasible that would be. So I'm looking for kind of advice on that part of the project when we come to it in a few months. And then once these pieces are in place, we'll do a pilot project where we'll take either pre-existing published data sets, either in GitHub or published externally outside GitHub, probably a mixture of those, and we will just do some kind of combination of our own manual curation of these data sets, producing the YAML ourselves. But what I hope to do is maybe kind of crowdsource some of this as well, and just kind of put a note out on Twitter and see if we can get some volunteers for people who are producing data sets. And again, we would target here more kind of like tech savvy people perhaps who are using GitHub to manage not only their data, but to manage some kind of like bioinformatics workflow as well, and get them to maybe kind of act as guinea pigs for this. I'd also hope to use it within the context of our own MARC initiative project as well, where we have a kind of like a centralized ETL pipeline called Dipper that pulls in multiple different data sources, and I would like to try integrating this strategy into Dipper as well, so that the central code base doesn't need to know about all data sets out there. It can just do a search of GitHub and pull in some of these data sets. And then finally, we're doing a kind of an evaluation to see how successful this is, to see what kind of uptake it was, how people found it in terms of ease of authoring the metadata and so on. And this will be the kind of last part of the project, in about 6 months from now. And then hopefully this will lead to further work after the project. The goals here are really just to demonstrate the feasibility with tech-savvy dataset producers, and then after that, we'd hope to make it really more usable by other people. And I hope that what I think we'll see happening is more and more people using sites like GitHub that has a lot of this kind of like version control and social coding built into it to distribute their data sets, that will make it all the easier to apply this strategy. But even so, I think we will still need to kind of like provide kind of like authoring tools to make it easier to author your metadata. And maybe we can even integrate these either with dataset repositories like Figshare and Dryad, and even with kind of like sites like GitHub itself, just to make it easier for people to do things like describe their metadata when they're depositing on GitHub. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. So any questions?
So Chris, this is Ian Ford, very nicely presented and very clearly structured as to your milestones and so on. And there's a lot in there one could ask questions about, but I'll focus just one on your first milestone, as it's coming up soon, around the YAML schema, and
Yep.
you've mentioned the use of HCLS in there. I think others on the call, like Philippe perhaps, might be able to sort of provide part of one end of this. Well, it might be a discussion about this, but bioCADDIE has published this initial take on a set of metadata, which has looked at HCLS among other things. So around that milestone, I think as it's coming up first, maybe some discussion around potential integration with that schema. If you're following HCLS, we may be very close already, but I think that sounds like an initial thing to get to grips with. It's not just with this core development team, though I think Philippe and Alejandra join this call fairly regularly, so maybe we do have the representation with that effort that we need, but I think that's an important effort to touch into.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so I wasn't aware of that. But I've worked with Philippe and Alejandra a lot, so hopefully maybe that's something we could kind of schedule a call just to talk about in more detail.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jan, for bringing this up. I was about actually to ask the same questions and to point that owing to the, especially for this prototyping exercise, it would be good to see how we can shape the YAML file so that its by construction is ready to answer a number of use cases that have been outlined by the working group so far. And that would be extremely useful.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
All the more so that in a way we have already a JSON schema for that, and we've got a JSON LD in the making.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So yeah, we definitely need to converge there. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that would be fantastic.
So what I suggest, what I'll probably do is I will just kind of mention you. I'll check in some kind of very preliminary thing into the repository and mention you. We can kind of discuss it from there. Right.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, we could also identify a number of test users possibly. I mean, we, as you pointed out, some groups are using GitHub as a repo, and we tested that approach for repositing a data set that we've been working with Giga Science. So that's an interesting place to look at.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I just have a comment, Chris, with reference to the GitHub. We have a bioCADDIE organization available. It's a private organization right now. So if you send me your GitHub, I think I sent you an email a couple of days ago. If you send me your GitHub username, I can give you access so you can create a repository into which you can then start putting all the stuff that you want to. That will be part of the bioCADDIE organization, and the rest of the folks who are on the call already have access to it.
Great, I will do that. But did you say the organization as a whole is a private one, or?
Yeah, so the organization, so most of the repositories there are private. There are probably one or two which are public.
Mm-hmm.
Just those that we use to collect issues, and the metadata specification repository that Philippe and Alejandra actually created is also public, as well as the Elasticsearch issue reporting repository. So we do have, I think, probably 3 of them that are public, but the rest of them are private still. So if you want to, it's up to you if you want to keep your code private or public at this point of time. Eventually, the idea is, of course, to make everything public, but once that'll happen once everything is more mature.
Okay, yeah. I would definitely like to keep this, as much of this, the parts I'm doing, as public as possible, just because it sort of fits in with the nature of the project, and kind of getting some volunteers to kind of help implement this and so on.
Okay.
Chris, this is Hua from UT Health. I have a question. So who are the primary users of your tools? Well, be curators in our team, or it will be dataset repository people? They may actually want to later use the tools to add metadata.
Well, the goal with this is really to get the people who are providing the data sets to provide as much information as possible, and to kind of like to provide kind of like hooks for them to kind of incentivize them to do it. You know, if they can actually see that, you know, by providing this metadata, they don't see some benefit 3 months down the line, but they see, you know, it immediately kind of like, you know, some kind of like downstream product immediately showing up after they check in their, you know, their metadata descriptor. They can maybe see it on some kind of dashboard or something like that. Then the idea is this will hopefully kind of incentivize them more to do it. But you know, again, it's with this pilot, it's really, you know, we don't expect to see, you know, all you know, all data set providers doing this kind of immediately. It'll be a kind of slow process, I think.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions for Chris?
What else do we have on the agenda, Annie?
So we're just going to go through the updates, specifically this, since we didn't do it in detail last time, and we were thinking about doing going over the updates that were done on the UI part.
So I'll hold any. I'll hold any other questions. Yeah.
Oh no, it's okay if you have questions. I think we still have time. Ian, you can go ahead.
I guess the one question I had, Chris, I mean, going back to one of the things you said at the outset was, I mean, you put it as programmers love metadata, but I think you immediately followed up, but that's not really the case. What's going on is this captured as part of the work they do anyway.
Yeah.
And you know, we encourage programmers to be working out of their version control system on a day-to-day basis, so that the code that they've been working with during the day is actually in that system, and it's not. And we don't treat the version control system as, hey, go and deposit stuff there when you're done. And integration and the tools that programmers use are integrated with version control systems like Subversion and Git and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you see how you see parallels of that sort of paradigm working with people who are working with data, and whether we see this around as a one-time deposit of the data, or really that we expect people who are working with these data sets to be working with them in the same kind of way, day to day in GitHub.
Yeah.
Is there a parallel?
Yeah, I think it maybe depends, you know, to some extent on the data sets, but you know, as that paper that I showed you, kind of like, you know, highlighted, you know, I think we will start to see, you know, more and more people using sites like GitHub for kind of like managing their data sets, and I think we'll see sites like GitHub just making it a bit easier and a bit, you know, at the moment, you know, it's still largely targeted towards people who are fairly kind of like, you know, kind of like geeky, kind of like GitHub, you know, Git itself is a fairly kind of complex version control system. But you know, my prediction is we will start to see it become more easier for other people to start kind of like sharing their data this way, and you know, just to be able to take advantage of some of the kind of like the versioning and rollback and that kind of thing. But even if we don't see that, maybe there's certain lessons that can be learned from this project for people who are, you know, using other kind of more conventional ways of depositing their data. You know, even if we could just come up with a kind of a format for a simple metadata packet that people could use when depositing in, you know, in Figshare or Dryad or whatever, and you know, making use of some of the same principles there, I think that could still be beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
So are there any other questions for Chris?
Maybe one more. but it could be taken offline. Regarding the validator, and again, the technology that you're exploring, does it involve shape expressions or anything like that, or similar ways to validate the user input?
So when you say shape extraction, do you mean a kind of RDF shape standard? Or?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
That wasn't I was thinking of a more conventional kind of, validation at the level of the YAML schema itself. But I would definitely be interested in talking more with you about that, because it sounds like it's something that you've probably thought about in some depth there as well. And it could be a kind of combination of approaches. There's nothing to stop you adding kind of like multiple validation steps in there.
Right. We will definitely need to catch up. Thanks,
yep.
Chris.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, so thanks, Chris, for a great presentation. Moving on, we went over this, I guess, in fair amount of detail last time. So we're not going to go over it too much, or we're not going to go over it right now. Also, Ergen is traveling, as is Jeff. So we move on to the pilot project integration task. It's pretty much remains the same as we had done. We are almost finished with the integration, at least the basic integration of all the pilot projects. The only thing that's remaining is moving some of the integrated parts of it from the local machine to the server, is what I understand. So with that should take a day or two for us to complete, and once we are done with that, it should be available for everybody to explore and play around with on the server. So this is true for pilot project 2.1, which is the ranking function based on citation metrics for the geo series data, as well as the DELF implementation for PDB. For the ranking function based on citation metrics, which is pretty much dataset mentions for PDB data, which is from pilot project 3.2, will take a little bit longer since we haven't heard from Peter and Chunan yet. So Relink has spent some time to kind of differentiate and delineate the different tasks that we have for the UI development, and she's going to talk briefly to you with regard about what's been done and what's been planned. There are some parts which I've put in as discussion, which is basically the user account. I guess we could maybe discuss it this time if time permits, or maybe next week we can talk about that.
Hi, this is Relink. So for our new version 0.2, we have some new features, like we have new interface and new icons, and on the home page we have pop-up dialog box for search results, so that user can go to each a specific data type or data repository directly. And then we have global statistics, like how many repositories we have and how many data sets we have, so that user can have a better understanding of our data. And we also have a function to track user search history. We leave the top, the most recent 5 search terms that user entered. Then we also have a find similar data set function. We use the algorithm implemented by the Trevor Cohen. So this is for PDB data only. So we also have a find a related publication from PubMed, and we use the title of the data set as a keyword. Next, we also provide link on top of each page. It links to the GitHub, so you can provide feedback to us. So we also have some error prevention because I remember Alejandra posted an issue on the GitHub says if user search without a keyword, it will have an error message. So we also fix that. So as for the next step, we will integrate the ranking by citation, by relevance, and by date function. And
okay. So we have a list actually of all the features that we want to implement, which is not being worked on. The status here says not started yet. And we also, for some of these things which are like, for example, personalized search, I think we need to briefly discuss as to whether we would like to give the option for the user to generate an account, which would be useful like for saving the search results and sharing these search results in different ways. And okay, go ahead.
So I know that all this sounds excellent, both on tracking what has been implemented and what has not been started, and questions of the kind that you're just describing. So my question is around how are we making this available as a public list to people, where we can perhaps have comments on the questions of the kind that you've just asked. Besides having the slides in these updates, where are these lists maintained and the discussions around them recorded?
So currently, I think Ruling has been maintaining this list, but we could put that up in Google Docs, so we could have some kind of spot where people could potentially, comment, but that would be restricted, I guess, to the folks in the code development team, I'm assuming.
So would GitHub serve? I mean, we're using the tracker in GitHub to report issues. How does GitHub fare in anyone's experience as a venue for feature requests? I mean, in some ways you can say sometimes an issue is a feature request, and certain tracking systems, allow you to designate something as one or the other. But not venturing. I don't have sufficient experience of GitHub to venture an opinion about that. I maybe know more about it in Jira than GitHub, but as we're already up in GitHub, I wonder whether there's anything we can do there.
I am not familiar enough with GitHub either to answer that question. I would have to look into it, but if anybody else has more experience.
I guess I can answer that, but I don't quite know the full context here, but this is just for new feature requests from people within the project, or is the idea anyone can make a feature request who's...
Well, I think we could set a scope on that as decided, but does it affect how you might comment about GitHub suitability, Chris?
No, I'd say it's generally pretty suitable. Where I guess it's more challenging if you just want, users who may not have GitHub accounts may want to make kind of flyby feature requests. In which case, you might want to kind of place some kind of interface on top of that. But for most purposes, GitHub is perfectly good for making feature requests as well as tracking bugs as well.
I think the plan is for us, we have an internal list of features we want to add on, and I think it's probably let's hold for requests for features from the community. Maybe let's finish what we plan to do, then we release it, then we try to get the feedback from the community for new features. And I think in the white paper what we're planning is trying to release a functional site probably the Q2 of the year 2. Is that right, Anu?
Yeah, that's right. So that the original plan is to release version 0.1, I think by February of 2016. That was end of Q2 of year 2. And
okay, I mean, I think that helps.
Limited release as well.
I think for now we can actually show you the complete list of features we plan to implement, at least for the internal group. This group, we can actually discuss it, right?
Okay, I mean, and whatever tooling works for doing that purpose. I mean, with regard to the comments earlier about private GitHub repositories, if we want to do it just amongst that group, we've still got the capability to use the tracker internally with that group. And I just raised the question of whether that may be helpful or not.
So it seems to me that maybe it should be broader than just the core development team. You can keep it internal within bioCADDIE, but I think the more eyes you have on this development and gradual implementation, the better, before actually going to the outside community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it
little bit noisy.
Like the fact that we're having this discussion here means that there does need to be some internal discussion, and I think I'm just raising this because I think some tooling may help that internal discussion.
Yeah, I think maybe next time we will show the complete list of the features in our mind, and we go from there to see if we're missing anything.
All right, that sounds like a good way forward.
Okay. I guess this is the remaining list of the tasks that we had in mind for us to implement as soon as possible. But we can go back and look at it again next time. So also just a reminder, please do deposit the codes in GitHub and contact me if you need access to the GitHub repository. And if there are any other issues that anybody wants to raise right now. You know, I think we are actually done on time today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anu.
Thank you, Anu. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
And Chris and all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.